personnel deck, feel all the ocean spray. Just up on the upper hotel deck, oh what a swell deck, great for your déjeuner. Turn the corner on the port parallel deck, it's Slough Bell deck, all of the rest passé. Now the band is ready, it's ragtime setting, we'll take you away. Everyone up and up, nobody lag about, let your lucky spirits fly.
Good morning. Welcome to another program in the Performing Arts series produced by the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. and Prince William County, Virginia Public Schools. My name is Jack Carr. The topic of today's program is Titanic, the making of a musical. I'll be talking with the acclaimed playwright and screenwriter Peter Stone, author of the book for the Tony Award-winning Broadway musical Titanic. I'll also be speaking with Susan Green, the production supervisor of the show, which will be playing at the Kennedy Center this summer. Peter, Susan, thank you for being with us today.
Good morning.
Our pleasure.
Peter, let's begin by talking about what is the difference between Titanic, the movie, and Titanic, the Broadway musical.
Well, I think it might be appropriate to see that first clip, and then it'll be easier to talk about.
Excellent. Let's do that then. Go right to the first clip.
Sailing day, morning bright, take your flight, ship of dreams. She strains at her lines, the smoke from her funnels trailing. Her prow like a knife, she'll cut through the waves unfailing. Soon to be underway, size and speed unexplored, and I'll be aboard that ship of dreams.
Peter, that's the opening number of Titanic, the musical of Broadway.
Right. It's a small portion of the opening number. It was a very, very long,
It's about 22 minutes, the opening number.
very complicated, very multifaceted, with many parts and many sections, up until this beginning with the arrival of the first crew members in the morning of the sailing, all the way through the sailing, actually, of leaving the port in England. The difference is, if you look at that piece of tape, you'll see most of the differences are there. One is it's music, of course, which and singing in the convention of a musical. Two, the painted scenery, the spare scenery. None of the absolute exquisite detail of the film, which is only film can do. Theater is a much more impressionistic, much more essence of certain things. First of all, you can do a great deal more on stage than you could when I started writing for Broadway, but still the film, and now film with its computer generated images and spectacles, can obviously do the sinking of the ship. We indicate the sinking of the ship. We actually indicate it so well the audience is quite involved with the sinking of the ship, but the difference is the basic difference between stage and screen.
Mm-hmm. The show's run on Broadway for 2 years, yes?
Yes.
And you won the Tony Award for Best Musical.
And we won all 5 that we were nominated for: Best Score, Best Book, Best Scenic Design, Best Show, and the Best Orchestration.
Right.
All we were nominated for.
And you have now a touring company of Titanic on the road.
For the next 2 years, it'll be crisscrossing across the country. There's no sensible pattern to it. It's just the way it was booked. I mean, it'll be coming from the West Coast to the East Coast, back to the West Coast, and so forth. Susan has been really the person in charge of making that go smoothly, and she's done a remarkable job.
So, Susan, you're bringing the show in to the Kennedy Center when?
I think it's in June. I think we're in the late June, early July, and we're here for the summer.
For the summer, good. And are you out with the show all the time?
No. I go back and forth. I just came from looking at the show in Seattle, and I'll go out to Chicago, which is where it is opening. It started performances last night, but I don't travel with the show all the time anymore.
Peter, let me come back to you and ask you, what is it that a book writer does?
That's probably the most misunderstood aspect of the musical theater. What is a book? Most people think the book is the dialogue. We know that actors make that up as they go along, so you can't be that. Actually, what a musical book is, quite seriously, two things, basically. One is construction, and two is concept. Especially now, when musicals started, the modern musical began in about 1943 with Oklahoma, and it's a musical. The difference is the book. Up until that time, during the heyday of the great Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, Rodgers and Hart, all of those, Jerome Kern, Cole Porter, during the really golden age of American stage music, those shows didn't have books. They had plots of some kind. A birthday celebration in Connecticut was a big, complicated story. And what happened is the people who wrote those stories, sort of, followed the score around. The composers wanted to do a score at the beach. You bloody well put it at the beach. You found some reason to go to the beach. When the book became primary to the story, to the music, it was very difficult for some of the old musicians, old composers and lyricists to start following the book rather than the other way around. But they did it. Mostly Oscar Hammerstein, who really invented the whole thing. He was a genius about that, and he invented what we now know as the book musical. And a musical, first of all, it's construction. It is the most complicated stage animal there is, because there are so many separate parts. There's so many separate collaborations. It's not just the music, lyrics, and book, but the director and the choreographer. You're dealing with dancing, you're dealing with scenery, you're dealing with orchestrations, with lighting. There are so many separate elements, and those have to be, all of that has to be constructed in the proper order. And books are more often rewritten than written. You go out of town to a place. I just did a completely new book for Annie Get Your Gun, which Bernadette Peters just opened on Broadway. And we came here to the Kennedy Center and did it here. And this being my, I think, 16th or 17th Broadway show, all Broadway shows are in trouble when they open out of town. That's just accepted. Larry Gelbart, the playwright and film writer, the man who wrote MASH, and several other things, once said, if Hitler's alive, I hope he's out of town with a musical. It can be a very stressful time. But if you don't like that, if you don't like getting in trouble out of town, you should go into some other business. Because that's where musicals happen, because audiences mostly tell you what to do. Audiences are wrong when individual members come up to you and say, you know what you ought to do? They're always wrong. But collectively, they're always right, and you can't argue with them. They tell you when they're bored, they tell you when they're amused, they tell you when they don't like it.
Told us
they
in New
cough, they move around, they leave.
That's right.
Let me say a word about Susan. Susan is in charge of the production stage manager, with the possible exception of test pilot. I can't think of a more stressful job, because she is in charge of the entire thing once the performances start. And if you don't have nerves of steel, or probably no nerves at all, you can't do it, because everything goes wrong in the middle of a production. And the scenery won't move, the lights are wrong, the sound goes out, the actors are in the wrong place, the costumes are, the wigs fall off. Everything happens while you're putting this all together, and she stands there with a script that has 200-300 cues in it, sound cues, light cues, set cues, actors cues, and she calls them off over a headset. And it's a very stressful job. Now, what happened, of course, once you open, all of that stress goes away. The show runs very well thanks to the preparation. And then, so a production stage manager can become a supervising person and go out, and because the stage manager then is really in charge of casting replacements, directing replacements, the road shows, keeping them running smoothly. And so it's a very important job, and it's relatively new to the medium.
Peter, before we deal with Susan's various nervous breakdowns, let's go back to the book of Titanic for a minute. We have some other clips that I want people to see today. Well, but what I would like us to understand at the beginning is, what is the difference in the story of the movie and the story that you have created?
Well, it's very, very different. Outside of the fact that they are dealing in the boat, and the boat hit an iceberg and sank, that is basically the similarities. The film, for reasons of their own, and of course it was a fatal decision because nobody saw the film, they chose to invent two characters, two young people who obviously became the show, the movie. And the stage show, which was done first, the musical, we dealt, Maury Eston, the composer, who's a very, very talented and very, very able composer whom we're going to be hearing a great deal more from. Probably during the show he'll call up and have something to say. But the fact is that he and I decided to use only truth, only real characters, only the people who were really aboard. We said they are the most interesting, the most fascinating people, and to not use them, they weren't in the film at all, and which I was quite surprised by. And you're going to see 4 clips, very short. They don't even give you a full sense of the first is a stoker. We started the show with 3 sailors from 3 members of the crew from below deck. A stoker who worked in the boiler room shoveling coal, a radio operator who received the iceberg warnings, and a lookout who was the first man to see the iceberg, because those 3 things, the speed of the ship, the iceberg warnings, and the visibility, were the 3 elements that came together that caused this accident to happen. And we balanced them with 3 people up on the top, on the bridge, the owner, the captain, and the builder. And each of them, through some personal flaw, made the ship, it was an inevitable thing that this ship would sink. It was someone once said, nothing devised by man is unsinkable. And if you think it is unsinkable, it will, because something will happen to it. Because by thinking it's unsinkable, you ignore the rudiments of avoiding disaster. In any case, so these 3, what you'll see in these 3 clips are these 2 of these 3 men who are sailors. You'll see the stoker first singing about the fact that he left the coal mines back in England and ends up stoking coal in the bottom of a ship back and you can't escape your fate. In the second clip, you'll see the same stoker when he goes up to the radio room to try to send a message to his, to propose to his girlfriend because he's afraid she won't wait for him. And and they have a little duet together. In the third sequence, the captain, the builder, and the owner, who have praised each other for having created this magnificent testament to the progress of the 20th century, when the ship is sinking, start to blame each other for the disaster. And finally, the 2 passengers, the Strausses. They're old people on their way back, and she is allowed on a lifeboat, and she says, no, I won't get on the lifeboat. We have been together 43 years. Where you go, I go. I can't live without you. And she gets off, and she dies with her husband. So these 4 pieces are just snippets of those stories.
All right, let's see it.
Coal it is that makes the steam, that runs the machines that run the world, that sends the men below the ground to man the coal each day. From Leicestershire in Nottingham, us lads who work down in the pit knew if you got above the ground, you'd save your soul some way. May God's heaven be your blanket as you sleep. marry me. Tit-tot-tit-tot-tit, marry me. Tit-tot-tit-tot. Signed, Fred. There stands the captain who sailed us straight into disaster. Pray who urged him to go faster? Well then, thank you, Mr. Ismay, for your contribution. Now please pray for some miraculous solution. Your timing is perfect, so help us please if you can. Who called for speed and to break every record? Who had to keep all the millionaires happy? How dare you, Smith? I will not stand here indicted. Who ignored warnings of icebergs when sighted? Who, sir, refused to extend up the bulkheads? You, sir, to give the first-class figure stateroom. And who undermined the position of captain? And who took a course too far north for the season? And who kept demanding we land never sooner? And who should have placed it on your mountain boxes? And who did it? Who did it? Who did it? Who did it? Who did it?
No one else could play your part. Forever know my mind.
True companion of my soul, I won't turn from you, I learn from still. Fortune's changes, still, always we've known that the promise we made kept us as one, and will. I love you then, and I love you still.
Peter, I'm fascinated by the idea that you chose that all the characters in your version of Titanic would be based in history. What does that mean with regard to the research that you had to do?
Well, it was extensive, but not as bad as it might seem. There are two very, very good books, and a couple of others that were helpful, but basically two books. Walter Lord wrote a book called A Night to Remember, and that he wrote it, I think, in the 50s, and it is just a masterful piece of work, and that book has almost everything in it. He wrote a sequel to it called The Night That Lives On, which talks about the inquiries into the accident, and it was helpful to it. Another book is called The Maiden Voyage. Once you've read those two books, everything you need to know. You know, it's the people more than the incidents. I underlined everything, cross-filed it in 4 notebooks that deal with the people, dealt with the data, the hour-by-hour events, dealt with the background, and dealt with the inquiries. And I had 4 books, and we all used them, and we all passed them around. And they were very helpful. Reality is a very, very dicey thing to put on the stage, because mostly reality does not come ordered very well for drama. Some European playwright said, God doesn't write second acts. What he meant by that is that reality provides first and third acts, but second acts are what people write because it's called theater. It looks like reality, but it isn't. And if you try to do reality, try to do something from history, most cases you either have to cheat on history to make it interesting for the stage, or be faithful to the reality and make it dull on the stage. But once in a while, a story comes along that's perfectly ordered, Aristotelianly ordered. It follows Aristotle's laws of theater, which were written, 2 millennia ago. And it has the unity of space. It's in a confined space, on a confined time period. It has this set of wonderful actors. It has the characters who are in the highest position are brought to the lowest through their own flaws. The climax happens exactly where it should happen at the end of the second act. And the third, playwrights deal in 3-act concepts, even though musicals in most theater have one intermission. you write in a construction of 3 acts, 3 sort of similar acts. By similar, I mean 3 acts that are consistent to themselves, what someone called acts of purpose, act of passion, act of perception. And those 3 acts that's construction. And what I was talking about before is that the book of a musical is more construction than almost anything else. The other thing, it's concept. And in this case, the concept was to give this sense of doom. And there's a property in the theater which is most interesting called suspension of disbelief. And suspension of disbelief, you'll notice, is a double negative. It's not the acceptance of belief, it's the suspension of disbelief. You go into a theater and there are seats and there's audience and there's lights and there's costumes and painted scenery and an orchestra, and very, very artificial. But the audience comes with the desire to involve themselves in it. It's built into the human soul that they want stories told. They're sitting around campfires and hunting stories up to today's very sophisticated theater. And so they're there, and they want to believe. And so they will forget that the ship is going to hit the iceberg because they want that drama to happen. And you must use it. You don't construct it, you get out of the way of it. The audience really does their work and does it very, very well. So all of that was there. And the characters that existed were so rich, but they exemplified 3 classes on board the ship. And the 3 social classes of the time matched the 3 classes on board. The first class, second class, third class were the same as the upper, middle, and lower classes that existed in the English-speaking world at that time. And so we tried to divide the ship into these 3 classes. The first class passengers, who were all the millionaires, the great millionaires of the world, who were there by right. It was their right to be there. The lower class, the working class, the immigrant class, they didn't care what ship they were on. They just matter of fact, they didn't even intend to be on Titanic. They drew it by lottery, and they just wanted to get to the new world where the opportunity was. The middle class was in many ways the most interesting, the second class, because they were people who wanted to be near the first class. And they wanted to be near the millionaires and hoped to rub elbows with them and hope to pick up something. And they very much mirrored the social structure of the time. And we were very taken with that. And we tried to parcel our characters out. We had the millionaires up in first class. We had the second class, the people who had social ambitions. And we had the third class was exemplified by 3 Irish girls, all named Kate. They were real characters aboard the ship. And so that was what we went after. And we were rather dismayed, Maury and I, Maury Eston, the composer, and I were rather dismayed when we went to see the film, and that none of these rich characters were there. They weren't, instead you got a very charming love story of 2 people who didn't exist. And they're very attractive and exceptionally attractive, it turns out. But still, we still hadn't seen all those people. Now, a lot of people came up to our box office and said, "Is Leonard going to be in it tonight?" And we'd have to say, "Well, not tonight. He's not going to be in it." And people said, "Well, I've seen it, haven't I?" Well, no, they haven't. What I wanted the ads to read was, "You saw the film, now come see what the film left out," which is practically what the show is. It's plus the fact that it's musically, it's so rich and so.
Yeah. You finally arrived at your book, and you, working with Maury Eston, the composer and lyricist, you arrived at the moment where you felt ready to put this on a stage. And I believe, Susan, that's where you enter.
Yes. Actually, the show was developed in a workshop about a year, I guess, before the first rehearsal. Peter and Maury got to a point where they felt they were ready to do something, to show something and see what their next step would be. Enter the director, Richard Jones, who cast 12 or 13, 12 people who played for 6 weeks all the parts that were written at the time. So, and every day would swap parts so that the woman who would play the bellboy one day would play the captain the next day. The man who played the architect would play a Kate. I mean, it didn't always work out the male-female role reversal, but it was definitely on purpose, and it was definitely so that the director could see and how the show was actually going to take shape.
And are they carrying scripts at this time? So that
Absolutely. This was in a rehearsal room, and it was just to work on scenes. Just there were no lines learned. People certainly learned some music, and there was a basic mock-up presentation of some staging. There were very few props. There were some little string to indicate the gangplank. There was suitcase. There were always suitcases, but it was very, very small.
So it's a period of experimentation,
Absolutely.
discovery.
And then everybody went away again for a year or so.
Almost, yeah.
And during that time, started to cast the show, and then
After the workshop,
yes,
during that year that you all went away, what were you doing?
Well, I did another show, actually. There wasn't all that much to do. What we learned, we learned. There wasn't so much rewriting at that point as there was understanding what was going to be done. But the casting took a long time. Authors, under the author's contract, authors have approval of the cast as well as director. Our director was a very interesting man. He's a British director. Most of his experience has been opera. I saw a play he'd done on Broadway, and it was so imaginative and so interesting that I went over to England and met him. I'd never met him, and talked to him, and he became interested in doing this. And then Maury liked him, and we hired him. And he'd never done. He did Steve Sondheim's and Lepine's Into the Woods in London. So different. It was done so differently from New York that it was. I called Sondheim and I said, "Did you like him?" And he said, "Oh, he's fascinating. He's wonderful." So we went ahead with that. And he was there for casting, and we all casted together. It took quite some time. It took because they had to build what would call an ensemble company. There are no real stars of it. It's like I had in 1776. Everybody has to be working together. Since 1776, I've never had an ensemble company that was as good as this group that worked together, and they stayed together. Mm-hmm. And they stayed. Most of the people, after 2 years, they were mostly there. 2/3 of them were still there, which is remarkable.
Susan, what is it that you do as production supervisor that puts a show, Titanic in this case, on its feet so that an audience can come?
Well, it's not just me. I can't possibly do this by myself. I had 3 other people who worked with me. We were responsible certainly for running rehearsals. Then when the show moved uptown to the Lunt-Fontanne and after the scenery was loaded in the door, we were responsible for running the technical rehearsals. We were responsible for then getting the show in some sort of shape so that the audience would see something on the first preview.
For people who've never been backstage and seen a technical rehearsal, what do you mean by that?
When there are many different elements come together to make the show: the scenery, the lights, the sound, the costumes, the hair, the makeup, the orchestra. And there has to be somebody who's sort of in charge of that so that all the different departments know what's going on, and we know that we can actually, because ultimately your focus is to get the show up on the stage. So there's one person, a little bit, I guess, like a quarterback. But I have a console, I have a headset, I have a million people talking to me on my headset, and I'm able to cue the various pieces of scenery to move and the various lights to change color and to dim or to brighten, depending on certainly what the designers have done. The stuff is, the technical end of it is all run by, there are people on the other end of that headset. I'm not just pushing a button to make things happen. I'm going to talk to somebody, and they're going to push a button, or they're going to pull a rope, or they're going to do something else, or hit a fader, or what they're going to do. So the elements of it are quite complex, and depending on the show, certainly. And Titanic was not, was seemingly streamlined and beautiful to look at, but backstage was choreographed as well within an inch of its little life.
There was very little backstage area, actually, and
there were 150 costume changes in the first act. So
in the first act,
yeah. and there was about the size. Actually, this table's a little larger than the stage right side, so it was quite difficult. And because certainly a lot of the Broadway houses are not equipped to actually carry the new, incredibly complex technical shows that are happening now.
I know that there are many chairs had to be stacked off stage because there are two dining room scenes. And you walk up stage, the minute they're used, they were hoisted up to the ceiling.
There's certainly more room in the air than there is on the floor.
So that was done.
Peter mentioned earlier that you had, I don't
He
know
also
whether
said
he
I had a
was-
nervous breakdown. I did not.
No,
I said that.
Oh,
I
okay.
I
responded to
said
that.
that she is without nerves. That you have to. You know what's interesting? More and more of your first line production stage managers are women now. I think because they're not as nervous. They're not as panicky as the men get. They are really rock-like back there. But Susan, unlike the guys, I've been with a lot of very good men's stage managers. They get angry a lot. That's their way of maintaining. Susan never loses her cool. She's always pleasant, always amusing.
Sedated.
Exactly. And I used to be 6 feet tall.
Susan, somewhere earlier, Peter made a reference to you being backstage with a book that had 300 cues. Is that the number?
No, it's not the number. Actually, it's about half that. That was about half the number because there were about 300 light cues, and then there were scenery moves. There are winches to call to move the automation. Because in order to get certain things timed out correctly, you can't all be done on pulling ropes, and also you'd run out of guys, and boy, they'd kill themselves. I mean, the scenery is incredibly heavy. The bridge that we made in New York was very, very heavy. It all had to be automated. So
Bridge.
There was a captain's bridge on the New York
Bridge of the Titanic.
On the bridge of the Titanic, and it had to be automated there so that indeed it could come in and go out at a speed that you could set. I could set off the computer to time to music, to time to scenery. We talked a little bit. You talked about working out of town, and we didn't have that luxury of working out of town. We didn't go out of town. We didn't go out of town. We worked in New York.
Terrible burden on a show not to go out of town.
So I did my homework a lot in front of the audience. There was certainly in every show that you do, there's scenery that doesn't work. There are things that don't work, and certainly the audience tells us that. Or you go away and you come back the next day and you know that that beautiful piece of scenery that you've built in there, takes 5 minutes to move across the stage, and you don't have a 5-minute scene. So but on this show, instead of making a quick fix so that you could continue, the writers and the director really decided that until they had what they wanted, there were going to be 2 spots in the first act one in the first act and one in the second act where I would announce over the loudspeaker at night that we would hold for 3 minutes.
In one case, 7 minutes. And I had to write a scene to fill the 7-minute thing, and it turned out fortuitously to be one of the more interesting scenes in the show. It's the porthole scene in the second act. One must talk about the hydraulics. This show in New York, we found a new method of doing it for the road, which in my mind creates certain things that are even more attractive than what we had in New York. But we had an hydraulic system whereby the ship started in the second act to tilt. And all of you could see it a little bit in that clip in the radio room. In the second scene in the radio room, it was on an angle. And the ship begins to tilt quite precipitously until just before the end, it's up very near being on end. And which is what happens on the touring company. Well, the one that will come to Washington or around the country also does, but in a different way. It's not hydraulic the way it was. And it was very complicated. The stage floor had to be picked up, and hydraulics had to be put in, and it was terribly complex, but worthwhile, because it created an amazing effect. When all the furniture, and in the case of the road show, all the people start to slide down the tilting deck.
Yeah. Susan, you made a reference to computers, and I'm remembering that it wasn't too long ago. There weren't any computers,
That's right.
so what people did backstage was quite different.
Sure, your lights were run not on a computer. They were run. You just couldn't do as much as you can now. I mean, the freedom that the computer has allowed us to do is to take theater more and more in a very technical way. I mean, you certainly couldn't sink our boat without a computer. You know, you couldn't make the stage floor. You couldn't make the stage floor tilt. You couldn't get that chandelier in. You know, you couldn't do a lot of the things.
Sound is a brand new element in technically in the theater, especially in the musical theater. There's now in the back of the house an enormous sound console, a sound console, which
When you say house, you mean theater.
the back of
Yes.
the theater, in the back of the theater, where behind where the audience sits, and in that on that console, every single member of the cast now has a cordless mic attached to them, the battery pack is somewhere on their person where it won't show in the costume, and the mic is usually with the men behind the ear. It's down here, or the women in the hair, and that every single person on stage can be orchestrated sound-wise by the sound technician in the back of the house. Plus, every single instrument in the orchestra has its own microphone and can be balanced. I know strange things happen, things the audience... For instance, when I did a show called Will Rogers' Follies, we used the area of the orchestra pit in such a way that we couldn't get our full orchestra into the pit. And the entire string section, about 8 pieces, was on the 8th floor of the hotel next door. And they watched the show, watched the conductor on monitors. They sat there, most of them in their underwear, reading magazines, drinking and playing, and they drinking coffee. And they, the string section never saw the show on the stage. I mean, they were up there, but the audience had no idea that the string section wasn't in the pit with the rest of the orchestra. On Annie Get Your Gun, we have the same thing. The whole orchestra's on stage, except for the string section, which is underneath the stage in another area. So sound has changed. Lighting has changed so radically. When I went to Yale Drama School, back just before World War I...
That late?
Yes, that late. Man named Stanley McCandless, who was one of the great lighting technicians who taught there, and he said light has 4 properties, and so it has brightness, it needs color, it has direction, and it has focus, and you must have 4 instruments for each of those to do that. Today, the thing called Verilights, they do everything. Verilights, they're very expensive, they cost a fortune, but they change any color. They have something like 31 separate colors.
Well, they're different. They're different.
You can move their
lights. The moving lights is what they are. You can program them to move to one side of the stage or not, and then they have colors you can scroll through, and every company has a different kind now. So, and they're all doing more and more things.
So if you were doing Titanic 20 years ago, it would look and be rather different.
Well, it would probably look a bit like the National Company in a strange way, because we solved it through mechanical means, we solved the problems. Having done it now, we solve those problems mechanically, not electronically, in terms of the set, including moving the set. And I find it terribly effective. Instead of being horizontal, it's vertical. Instead of being vertical, it's horizontal. And the way it's been redirected and restaged, I found very, very moving and very interesting. And so you can solve it. And so we've also, preparing for stock and amateur, we're preparing another version of it, to be done in high schools or summer theaters or wherever, that relies a great deal on projected scenery, we send to those theaters a kit, and the kit has 60 slides, and the slides involve scenery. They also involve maybe still pictures of the actual ship, of the actual passengers, and so the scenery will all be constructed visually through audio-visual ways, visual mostly, and you can play it without any scenery at all. Even the tilt will be done by the slides and the effect of the tilt.
You mentioned preparing a script that would be useful in community and school theaters. Could we shift a little bit and talk with an orientation toward high school for a minute? We have some people in our audience today, both here in Prince William and out there in the country, who are certainly interested in becoming writers and perhaps writers for the theater. How do young people go about getting somebody to pay attention to them?
I think really that hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is that the allure of film and television has, everybody wants to write a movie now, but the way to discovery is the same as it has always been. your work really speaks. And there are so few good people at anything. There are very few good plumbers, there are very few good lawyers, there are very few good... And if you're a good writer, it becomes evident. It's very rare that someone who is talented, who writes well, isn't discovered at some point. Now, their discovery may not lead them to the top, but they will certainly be discovered. Other elements get into it. Talent is a great deal of it, but a lot more is involved than that, and that is a kind of, there's a kind of desire is involved in it. Just like athletes, you can be very athletically inclined, but the desire is very, very important. And I think that you just show your work, and the work impresses. And when it impresses, it starts to become disseminated. And I think there's no other way to do that.
If a person felt at a point in high school that he or she wanted to be a writer of screenplays or theater works, would you recommend something in a special way with regard to majoring in college?
Well, yes. I mean, getting involved in your theater, now schools have film programs as well. Getting involved is certainly good. If you're really determined and you've shown promise, there are postgraduate plays. I mean, I went to Yale. Carnegie Tech is very good. The Tisch Theater at NYU, the Tisch School at NYU. Certainly, there are several schools, West Coast, that are postgraduate. You get MFAs, Masters of Fine Art, and you get those. And you know, there are programs. Then there are places where you get very practical. You have to apply, like the AFI, the American Film Institute, out in Los Angeles. They accept applicants for that. I've been a screenwriter. I started as, I was born and raised in Los Angeles in a film family, but somehow theater was what drew me back east. And so I left after high school and came back to college and stayed in the East Coast for theater. But I've written a great number of films. And maybe 24 of them. And I am not the world's biggest advocate on screenwriting. I love doing it. I just don't like what happens to it after you've finished it. It's not a very pretty process for writers. If you are proprietary, if you care about your work, you're going to be very, very disappointed by what happens to your work after it leaves your hands. Because they will take it and they will bring other people into it and everybody will change it and you won't recognize it when it gets on. Now, the money's good, and if that's what you want. But I say if you really want money, then dentistry is probably the best place. The average is very good. Law is second. And
you can write on the side.
Yes, or forget about it. But the fact is, if you really want to see your work as you wrote it, and as you believe in it, and follow the process through, the theater's the place. For a simple reason, you own the copyright. And whoever owns the copyright controls the work. And in film, your copyright's gone. They own it, and they can do what they want. In the stage, no one can change a word, add a word, subtract a word without your approval. And it's very heady stuff.
Well, I guess it is. Susan, do you have strong feelings about how people can prepare to do your work?
You wouldn't want to, I mean, don't do it.
Don't
no,
do it.
We're not being encouraging, are we?
No, I started out as an actor, and I wasn't particularly good. But what it did teach me was how to talk to actors, certainly, well, as opposed to just knowing what I think you're supposed to do technically or whatever. There's a lot to do, and I think if somebody wants to do this kind of work, the most important thing is to do as much different kinds of things as you can possibly do and work with as many different kinds of people as you can possibly work with, and get your hand in lighting, in acting, in costume, in props, and just to see where it is that you might want to end up.
At Yale, one of the most valuable thing that happened to me at Yale was not playwriting class, which was okay. It was the fact that I learned, I took classes in acting and directing and scenic design and in lighting, just as Susan said, because if you don't understand all of the disciplines, you won't be able to deal in the medium, because the theater is the most collaborative thing there is.
Thank you for that advice. It's time for us now to hear from some people in the audience. both here in Prince William, but also people who may be interested in calling in. And people can do that by dialing 1-800-578-1396. But in the meantime, why don't we start here? I see a happy face with a question.
There are so many Broadway musicals out there now for us as an audience to see. What do you think truly separates your musical from the rest? What do you think is so unique about your musical that the audience would truly want to see it?
Well, I think each musical is different from every other musical. I wouldn't say that this experience would be at the expense of not seeing the others. I think you should see all of the shows that interest you and that are good. But this show has one area of uniqueness, and that is it deals with a remarkable actual subject, and there's very little of that on the stage, and it deals with it in a way of both using all the impressionistic things of the theater and in a lovely musical score, but it deals with this true event, and I think that is its strongest, which the film really didn't do, and that this does.
And another question.
Well, yeah, I just want to say that you people are really, truly amazing, and in your work. And I was curious on how long does a major production such as Titanic and all its complexities, how long would that take? I mean, with everything that goes along with it.
That again it depends from show to show. It's a good question. You write it at your own pace. And it can take a year, it can take, in the case of 1776, I think I wrote it in about 4 frenzied months. But in some shows, a year and a half. Then you look around for a production, and it might take a while to do. And it might, so there's no prescribed time. But from the time a producer takes it, to the time it opens, you've got to figure roughly in the area of 9 months to a year period for that to come together.
In the case of Titanic, when we started, from the time we started rehearsals, which was the beginning of January, until the time we opened, which was the middle of April. That's the amount of time we had on this show.
Okay. Thank you. We have a call from New Jersey. Hello, New Jersey.
Hi.
We can't hear you.
Hello.
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 Our question is, do you think that the popularity of the film affected the success of the play?
Yes, good question. Yes, in 2 ways. At the beginning, it was very, very helpful to the show. The show was a big hit at that time, but there was an added interest in the show and all things Titanic. By the time the film had finished playing, there was a kind of a battle fatigue had gone on. People had been sort of Titanic'd out, and the subject looked at it. And also, a lot of people who were not as sophisticated about the stage or the screen thought they'd seen it already in an odd way. They thought they'd seen it. So in the end, I mean, it had a Broadway run of 2 years before the road company went out. That's far more than West Side Story or Gypsy or Carousel or Brigadoon. It's far more than those shows had. But today's economic situation, you try to run it, in the case of, there's certain shows that never close, they go on forever. And I have a feeling without the film, Titanic would be going 5, 6, 7, 8 years on Broadway. So to that extent, I think it was harmful. However, on the road show, what's interesting is that the theater audiences you get in each city are basically theater audiences for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. And they are very, very, they're very cognizant of the differences.
Okay. Thank you, New Jersey. We also have a call from Philadelphia. Hello, Philadelphia.
Hi, how are you? This question is for Ms. Green. I'd like to know if you could give me an idea how long it took you to get where you're at today. For example, did you have to get a master's, and how many years did it take you to get
This was my first job. Titanic was my first job. I've been in this business wait a minute. I've been in this business a long time. And I started off-Broadway, working off-Broadway, and then I started to work at Radio City Music Hall, and then my scope started to get larger and larger, and the next thing I knew, I was only doing shows that had, big scenery and a lot of people and potential nightmare-making problems. But I would say it's been a good 20 years now.
I should tell you that Susan has also done the same kind of work that she's doing now for many years of Phantom of the Opera. She also has done the same work for Cats, How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying,
None of
and
them little,
Showboat.
right?
Right.
None
Big
of them
shows.
very small shows. My dream is that 3 guys on stools, you know, no scenery.
This theater's a thing. Is a very much of theater is learning by doing. You know, really.
But I didn't. I'm sorry. To get back to the question, I did not get a master's. As I said, I was an actor. I went to Sarah Lawrence. I was an actor, and so the idea of doing this actually was pretty alien to me. But I fell into it backwards, upside down, and it was something that I really liked, and I found I could be creative to some degree. I didn't want to be a director. I'm not that creative. But I certainly could take the director's vision and keep the show in shape. So, and keep it hopefully looking 2 years after it opened, pretty much the way it looked when we started rehearsals in New York.
Okay. We have another call from, thank you, Philadelphia.
Hope that answered your question.
Another call, this time from Erie, Pennsylvania. Hello, Erie.
Okay, we have a question. What other shows and films have you written?
Aha, Peter,
you.
what other shows and films?
Well, in film, my experience in film, I started writing early. My first film was a film called Charade with Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn. And I followed that up with another film with Cary Grant. And I've done a great number of films over the years. The last was a film with Sean Connery called Just Cause. The stage shows I've done, I started originally with a show, my first show, I didn't intend to write musicals. I was a playwright, but my first show on Broadway was a musical I got sort of pushed into, and I was glad I did, and I became infected by the form. And of the 17 shows I've done now on Broadway, 16 were musicals. And I did, going backwards, before we just did 1776 again, a revival. And we had Will Rogers' Follies, and I've got Annie Get Your Gun Now, a new book for it. And before that, I had Woman of the Year and Sugar and 2 by 2, and there's some I'm leaving out. My one and only, a little show I loved with Tommy Tune and Twiggy. I had a great time with that. We did a lot of work on Grand Hotel. I've enjoyed myself, and I'm hard at work with a new one that's about to go into rehearsal now, which is another fixing up of another old show which I saw when I first came to New York, which is Finian's Rainbow, which is a marvelous show that hasn't been done in over 50 years because it has a sort of pre-book book, and so
So you're bringing it up today?
Yes.
Great. We have another question in the studio.
Hi. You mentioned earlier that the setting has been changed from vertical to horizontal. What other differences would those audience members who have seen it in New York notice when they come to the Kennedy Center or other places on the road?
I would say that's it. That would be it. In other words, and you don't notice that because one of the more interesting scenic devices is the coming down from above of the lookout. That's there. We do that in every town. He lowers down, the crow's nest comes down. There was one scene where the bridge is in the top level, the first, second, and third class decks in the middle, and the smoking room, the card room, is on the bottom level, which is a wonderful effect on the Broadway show. But what they've done now, instead of making it vertical, they blend through each other, and they keep exchanging places, and it's very choreographic, even though they're not dancing. It's very beautifully staged, and the scene behind it, the drop behind it is blood red, causing an enormous amount of anxiety and pressure. And I just think the scene is beautiful to look at. And as a result, that's it. That's the only difference. When the ship starts to tilt, it starts to tilt. And just the same way, you wouldn't notice the difference.
Okay. Peter, before we leave, I'd like to ask you a question. You are the only writer who has received an Emmy, an Oscar, and Tony Awards. Does that give you a big head?
Yes. No, it doesn't. It's not. I think one can very easily overestimate what awards are. Awards, certainly they're better than not having them. But after all, the work I've had very good work that has received nothing. And I've had work, frankly, that was, I thought, in my mind, mediocre. That's won awards. So you have to remain a little even keeled over the thing, and to use our nautical terms. Yes, now that we're in it.
Well, thank you very much, Peter Stone and Susan Green, for being here today and helping us understand, well, some of the ins and outs, I guess, of Titanic, the Broadway musical. And may you have marvelous success. Those of you out in the country, be on the lookout. The show is out for 2 years, and it's only been on the road now for about 4 months. So you have a lot of opportunity to see Titanic, the Broadway musical. Today's program is the final one in the Performing Arts series for this school year. The series will return in the fall, presented again by the Kennedy Center and the Prince William Network. For additional information about the Performing Arts series, go to the Kennedy Center's website at the address shown on your screen. Until then, make your life richer by making the arts a part of your life every day. Peter, when you do, we're supposed to be, you know, now. Busy. Yes. When you do what you do, let me go back. When you started on the script, how long did it take you to finish?
Not that long. It didn't take that long once. It probably took.
Oh, loud. I'm sorry. That I didn't. Louder. Yeah, we can talk louder.
Oh, good.
How long did it take? How long did it take you to write the script?
Once the research was done, and once you work very closely with the best way. There's a lot of people who like, well, not so much anymore. Used to, the score was written, then you'd write a book afterwards, or the book was written, and they'd write a score. But by far the best way is to work simultaneously with the book writer, and don't get ahead either one of the other. So we used to meet. We worked in a Chinese restaurant. We went in for lunch, and we stayed sometimes till 3 or 4 in the afternoon. They hated us there. Anyway, but we sat there and worked out a scene and the song that belonged in it, and then we went home and worked. And he wrote the song, and I wrote the scene, but we knew what we were doing, because nothing offends a book writer more than the composer taking his best scene and musicalizing it. Anyway, so you're best not to write that scene. But in Titanic, very interesting thing happened. We developed a style that I've never seen before, where they sing and talk back and forth between speech and lyricizing a scene. The scene, and it's very, very, and been very well handled by the orchestrations and the thing. So altogether, it took us about, I would say, 5 months or so from the time we knew what we were going to do.